as per usual. I'm going to put on some background music for us. Today, I'm going to reach back into this box set, which is mood music for listening and relaxation. Two things that we're going to be doing here right now, listening and relaxing. And the disc I've chosen is disc number 9, which is listening and relaxing in 3/4 time. So let's listen and relax in 3/4 time. All right. Luke! Luke! Still rubbing the morning sleep from his eyes, Owen glanced from side to side, loosening his neck muscles. Where could that boy be loafing now? He wondered aloud at the lack of response. There was no sign of movement in the homestead, and he had already checked above. Luke! He yelled again. Luke! 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 The name echoed teasingly back at him from the homestead walls. Turning angrily, he stalked back into the kitchen, where Beru was preparing breakfast. Have you seen Luke this morning? He asked as softly as he could manage. She glanced briefly at him, then returned to her cooking. Yes, he said he had some things to do before he started out on the South Ridge this morning, so he left early. Before breakfast? Owen frowned worriedly. That's not like him. Did he take the new droids with him? I think so. I'm not sure. I saw at least one of them with him. Well, Owen mused, uncomfortable, but with nothing to really hang imprecations on. He'd better have those Ridge units repaired by midday, or there'll be hell to pay. An unseen face, shielded by smooth white metal, emerged from the half-buried life pod that now formed the backbone of a dune slightly higher than its neighbors. The voice sounded efficient, but tired. Nothing, the inspecting trooper muttered to his several companions. No tapes and no sign of habitation. Powerful handguns lowered at the information that the pod was deserted. One of the armored men turned, calling out to an officer standing some distance away. This is definitely the pod that cleared the rebel ship, sir, but there's nothing on board. Yet it's set down intact, the officer was murmuring to himself. It could have done so with automatics, but if it was a true malfunction, then they shouldn't have been engaged. Something doesn't make sense. Here's why there's nothing on board, and no hint of life, sir, a voice declared. The officer turned and strode several paces to where another trooper was kneeling in the sand. He held up an object for the officer's inspection. It shone in the sun. Droid plated, the officer observed, after a quick glance at the metal fragment. Superior and underling exchanged a significant glance, then their eyes turned simultaneously to the high mesas of the north. Gravel and fine sand formed a gritty fog beneath the land speeder as it slid across the rippling wasteland of Tatooine on humming repulsors. Occasionally, the craft would jog slightly as it encountered a dip or a slight rise to return to its smooth passage, as its pilot compensated for the change in terrain. Luke leaned back in the seat, luxuriating in unaccustomed relaxation as Threepio skillfully directed the powerful landcraft around dunes and rocky outcrops. You handle a land speeder pretty well for a machine, he noted admiringly. Thank you, sir, a gratified Threepio responded, his eyes never moving from the landscape ahead. I was not lying to your uncle when I claimed versatility is my middle name. In fact, on occasion, I have been called upon to perform unexpected functions in circumstances which would have appalled my designers. Something pinged behind him, then pinged again. Luke frowned and popped the land speeder canopy. A few moments of digging in the motor casing eliminated the metallic bark. How's that? He yelled forward. Threepio signaled that the adjustment was satisfactory. Luke turned back into the cockpit and closed the canopy over them again. Silently, he brushed his wind-whipped hair back out of his eyes, and his attention returned to the dry desert ahead of them. Old Ben Kenobi is supposed to live out in this general direction, even though nobody knows exactly where. I don't see how that R2 unit could have come this far so quickly. His expression was downcast. We must have missed him back in the dunes somewhere. He could be anywhere out here, and Uncle Owen must be wondering why I haven't called in from the South Ridge by now. Threepio considered a moment, then ventured, Wouldn't it help, sir, if you told him that it was my fault? Luke appeared to brighten at the suggestion. Sure, he needs you twice as much now. Probably he'll only deactivate you for a day or so, or give you a partial memory flush. Deactivate? Memory flush? 3PO added hastily. On second thought, sir, Artoo would still be around if you hadn't removed his restraining module. But something more important than fixing responsibility for the little robot's disappearance was on Luke's mind at the moment. Wait a minute, he advised 3PO as he started fixing his instrument panel. There's something dead ahead on the metal scanner. Can't distinguish outlines at this distance, but judging by size alone, it could be our wandering little droid. Hit it! The land speeder jumped forward as 3PO engaged the accelerator, but its occupants were totally unaware that other eyes were watching as the craft increased its speed. The eyes were not organic, but then they weren't wholly mechanical either. No one could say for certain, because no one had ever made that intimate a study of the Tusken Raiders, known less formally to the margin farmers of Tatooine simply as the Sand People. The Tuskens didn't permit close study of themselves, discouraging potential observers by methods as effective as they were uncivilized. A few xenologists thought they must be related to the Jawas. Even fewer hypothesized that the Jawas were actually the mature form of the Sand People, but this theory was discounted by the majority of serious scientists. Both races affected tight clothing to shield them from Tatooine's twin dose of solar radiation. But their most comparisons ended. Instead of heavy woven cloaks like the Jawas wore, the Sand People wrapped themselves mummy-like in endless swathings and bandages and loose bits of cloth. Where the Jawas feared everything, a Tusken Raider feared little. The Sand People were larger, stronger, and far more aggressive. Fortunately for the human colonists of Tatooine, they were not very numerous, and elected to pursue their nomadic existence in some of Tatooine's most desolate regions. Contact between human and Tusken, therefore, was infrequent and uneasy, and they murdered no more than a handful of humans per year. Since the human population had claimed its share of Tuskens, not always with reason, a peace of sort existed between the two, as long as neither side gained an advantage. One of the pair felt that the unstable condition that temporarily shifted in his favor, and he was about to take full advantage of it as he raised his rifle toward the land speeder. But his companion grabbed the weapon and shoved down on it before it could be fired. This set off a violent argument between the two, and as they traded vociferous opinions in a language consisting of mostly consonants, the land speeder sped on its way. Either because the speeder had passed out of range, or because the second Tusken had convinced the other, the two broke off the discussion and scrambled down the backside of the high ridge. Snuffling and shifting of weight took place at the ridge bottom as the two banthas stirred at the approach of their masters. Each was as large as a small dinosaur, from bright eyes and long, thick fur. They hissed anxiously as the two Sand People approached, then mounted them from knee to saddle. With a kick, the banthas rose. Moving slowly, but with enormous strides, the two massive horned creatures swept down the back of the rugged bluff, urged on by their anxious, equally outrageous manhounds. It's him, all right, Luke declared, with mixed anger and satisfaction as the tiny tripodal form came into view. The speeder banked and swung down onto the floor of a huge sandstone. Luke slipped his rifle out from behind the seat and swung it over his shoulder. Come round in front of him, 3PO, he instructed. With pleasure, sir. The R2 unit obviously noted their approach, but made no move to escape it. It could hardly have outrun the land speeder anyway. R2 simply halted as soon as it detected them and waited until the craft swung around in a smooth arc. 3PO came to a sharp halt, sending up a low cloud of sand on the smaller robot's right. Then the whine from the land speeder's engine dropped to a low idling hum as 3PO put it in parking mode. A last sigh, and the craft stopped completely. After finishing a cautious survey of the canyon, Luke led his companion out onto the gravel surface and up to Artoo Detoo. Just where, he inquired sharply, did you think you were going? A feeble whistle issued from the apologetic robot, but it was Threepio, and not the rover, who was abruptly doing most of the talking.
Master, Master Luke is now your rightful owner, Artoo. How could you just amble away from him like this? Now that he's found you, let's have no more of this Obi-Wan Kenobi gibberish. I don't know where you picked that up, or the melodramatic hologram either.
Artoo started to beep in protest, but Threepio's indignation was too great to permit excuses.
And don't talk to me about your mission. What rot! You're fortunate Master Luke doesn't blast you into a million pieces right here and now.
Not much chance of that, admitted Luke, a bit overwhelmed by Threepio's casual vindictiveness. Come on, it's getting late. He eyed the rapidly rising suns. I just hope we can get back before Uncle Owen really lets go.
If you don't mind my saying so,
Threepio suggested, apparently unwilling that the R2 unit should get off so easily.
I think you ought to deactivate the little fugitive until you've gotten him safely back into the garage.
No, he's not going to try anything. Luke studied the softly beeping droid sternly. I hope he's learned his lesson. There's no need to... He was interrupted, but also I need a drink. I hope he's learned his lesson. There's no need to... Without warning, the R2 unit suddenly leaped off the ground. No mean feat considering the weakness of the spring mechanisms in his 3 thick legs. His cylindrical body was twisting and spinning as he let out a frantic symphony of whistles, hoots, and electronic exclamations. Luke was tired, not alarmed. What is it? What's wrong with him now? He was beginning to see how Threepio's patience could be worn thin. He had had about enough of this addled instrument himself. Undoubtedly, the R2 unit had acquired the hollow of the girl by accident, then used it to entice Luke into removing his restraining module. Threepio probably had the right attitude. Still, once Luke got its circuits realigned and its logic couplings cleaned, it would make a perfectly serviceable farm unit. Only, if that was the case, then why was Threepio looking around so anxiously?
Oh my, sir. R2 claims there are several creatures of unknown type approaching from the southeast.
That could be another attempt by R2 to distract them, but Luke couldn't take that chance. Instantly, he had his rifle off of his shoulder, and he had activated its energy cell. He examined the horizon in the indicated direction and saw nothing. But then, Sand People were experts at making themselves unseeable. Luke suddenly realized exactly how far out they were, how much ground the land speeder had covered that morning. I've never been out in this direction this far from the farm before, he informed Threepio. There are some awfully strange things living out here. Not all of them have been classified. It's better to treat anything as dangerous until determined otherwise. Of course, if it's something utterly new... His curiosity prodded him. In any case, this was probably just another ruse of Artoo Detoo's. Let's take a look, he decided. Moving cautiously forward and keeping his rifle ready, he led Threepio toward the crest of a nearby high dune. At the same time, he took care not to let R2 out of his sight. Once at the top, he lay flat and traded his rifle for the macro binoculars. Below, another canyon spread out before them, rising to a wind-weathered wall of rust and ochre. Advancing the binocs slowly across the canyon floor, he settled unexpectedly on 2 tethered shapes, banthas, and riderless.
Did you say something, sir?
Wheezed Threepio, struggling up behind Luke. His locomotors were not designed for such outer climbing and scrambling. Banthas, all right, Luke whispered over his shoulder, not considering in the excitement of the moment that Threepio might not know a bantha from a panda. He looked back into the eyepieces, refocusing slightly. Wait, it's Sand People for sure. I see one of them. Something dark suddenly blocked his sight. For a moment, he thought that a rock might have moved in front of him. Irritably, he dropped the binoculars, and he reached out to move the blinding object aside. His hand touched something, like soft metal. It was a bandaged leg, about as big around as both of Luke's together. Shocked, he looked up, and up. The towering figure glaring down at him was no Jawa. It had seemingly erupted straight from the sand. Threepio took a startled step backward and found no footing. His gyros whined in protest. The tall robot stumbled backward down the side of the dune. Frozen in place, Luke heard steadily fading bangs and rattles as Threepio bounced down the steep slope behind him. As the moment of confrontation passed, the Tusken let out a terrifying grunt of fury and pleasure. and brought down his heavy Gatarifi. The double-edged axe would have cleaved Luke's skull neatly in two, except he threw the rifle up in a gesture more instinctive than calculated. His weapon deflected the blow, but would never do so again. Made from cannibalized freighter plating, the huge axe shattered the barrel and made metallic confetti of the gun's delicate insides. Luke scrambled backward and found himself against a steep drop. The raider stalked him slowly, weapon held high over its rag-enclosed head. It uttered a gruesome, chuckling laugh, the sound made all the more inhuman by the distortion effect of its grid-like sand filter. Luke tried to view his situation objectively, as he had been instructed to do so in survival school. Trouble was, his mouth was dry, his hands were shaking, and he was paralyzed with fear. With the raider in front of him, and probably a fatal drop behind, something else in his mind took over, and opted for the least painful response. He fainted. None of the raiders noticed Artoo Detoo, as the tiny robot forced himself into a small alcove in the rocks near the land speeder. One of them was carrying Luke's inert form. He dumped the unconscious youth in a heap next to the speeder, then joined his fellows as they began swarming over the open craft. Supplies and spare parts were thrown in all directions. From time to time, the plundering would be interrupted, as several of them quibbled or fought over a particularly choice bit of booty. Unexpectedly, distribution of the land speeder's contents ceased, and with frightening speed, the raiders became part of the desertscape, looking in all directions. A lost breeze idled absently down the canyon. Far off in the west, something howled. A rolling, booming drone ricocheted off canyon walls and crawled nervously up and down a Gorgon scale. The Sand People remained poised a moment longer. Then they were uttering loud grunts and moans of fright as they rushed to get away from the highly visible land speeder. The shivering howl sounded again, nearer this time. By now, the Sand People were halfway to their waiting banthas that were likewise lowing tensely and tugging their tethers. Although the sound held no meaning for Artoo Detoo, the little droid tried to squeeze himself even deeper into the almost cave. The booming howl came closer. Judging by the way the Sand People had reacted, something monstrous behind the imagination had to be behind that rolling cry. Something monstrous and murder-bent, which might not have the sense to distinguish between edible organics and inedible machines. Not even the dust of their passing remained to mark where the Tusken Raiders had only minutes before been dismembering the interior of the land speeder. Artoo Detoo shut down all but vital functions, trying to minimize noise and light as a swishing sound grew gradually audible. Moving toward the land speeder, the creature appeared above the top of a nearby dune. And that is the end of Chapter 4. Cheers. Chapter 5. It was tall, but hardly monstrous. Artoo frowned inwardly as he checked ocular circuitry and reactivated his innards. The monster looked very much like an old man. He was clad in a shabby cloak and loose robes hung with a few small straps and unrecognizable instruments. Artoo searched the human's wake, but detected no evidence of a pursuing nightmare. Nor did the man appear threatened. Actually, Artoo thought, he looked kind of pleased. It was impossible to tell where the odd arrival's overlapping attire ended and his skin began. That aged visage blended into the sand-stroked cloth, and his beard appeared but an extension of the loose threads covering his upper chest. Hints of extreme climates other than desert, of ultimate cold and humidity, were etched into the seamed face. A questing beak of a nose, like a high rock, protruded outward from flash flood of wrinkles and scars. The eyes bordering it were a liquid crystal azure. The man smiled through sand and dust and beard, squinting at the sight of the crumpled form lying quietly alongside the land speeder. Convinced that the Sand People had been the victims of an auditory delusion of some kind, conveniently ignoring the fact that he had experienced it also, likewise assured that this stranger meant Luke no harm, Artoo shifted his position slightly, trying to obtain a better view. The sound produced by a tiny pebble he dislodged was barely perceptible to his electronic sensors, But the man whirled as if shot. He stared straight at Artoo's alcove, still smiling gently. "Hello there," he called. He called in a deep, surprisingly cheerful voice. "Come here, my little friend. No need to be afraid." Something forthright and reassuring was in that voice. In any case, the association of an unknown human was preferable to the remaining isolated in the wasteland. Waddling out into the sunlight, Artoo made his way over to where Luke lay sprawled. The robot's barrel-like body inclined forward as he examined the limp form. Whistles and beeps of concern came from within. Walking over, the old man bent beside Luke and reached out to touch his forehead, then his temple. Shortly, the unconscious youth was stirring and mumbling like a dreaming sleeper. "Don't worry," the human told Artoo. "He'll be all right." As if to confirm this opinion, Luke blinked, stared upward uncomprehendingly, and muttered, "What happened?" "Rest easy, son," the man instructed him as he sat back on his heels. "You've had a busy day." Again, the boyish grin. You've been mighty lucky. That little head of yours is still attached to the rest of you." Luke looked around, his gaze coming to rest on the elderly face hovering above him. Recognition did wonders for his condition. "Ben? It's got to be." A sudden remembrance made him look around fearfully, but there was no sign of Sand People. Slowly, he raised his body to a sitting position. "Ben Kenobi? Am I glad to see you?" Rising, the old man surveyed the canyon floor and rolling rim wall above. One foot played with the sand. "The Junland wastes are not to be traveled lightly. It's the misguided traveler who tempts the Tuskens' hospitality." His gaze went back to his patient. "Tell me, young man, what brings you out this far into nowhere?" Luke indicated Artoo Detoo. "This little droid. For a while, I thought he'd gone crazy, claiming he was searching for a former master. Now I don't think so. I've seen such devotion I've never seen such devotion in a droid, misguided or otherwise. There seems to be no stopping him. He even resorted to tricking me." Luke's gaze shifted upward. He claims to be the property of someone called Obi-Wan Kenobi." Luke watched closely, but the man showed no reaction. "Is that a relative of yours? My uncle thinks he was a real person. Or is it just some unimportant bit of scrambled information that got shifted in his primary performance bank?" An introspective frown did remarkable things to that sandblasted face. Kenobi appeared to ponder the question, scratching absently at his scruffy beard. "Obi-Wan Kenobi," he recited. "Obi-Wan. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. A long time. Most curious." "My uncle said he was dead," Luke supplied helpfully. "Oh, he's not dead," Kenobi corrected him easily. "Not yet. Not yet." Luke climbed excitedly to his feet, all thoughts of Tusken Raiders forgotten now. "You know him?" A smile of perverse youthfulness split the collage of wrinkled skin and beard. "Of course I know him. He's me. Just as you probably suspected, Luke. I haven't gone by that name, Obi-Wan, though, since before you were born." Then Luke gestured at Artoo Detoo. "This droid does belong to you, then, as he claims." "Now, that's the peculiar part," an openly puzzled Kenobi confessed, regarding the silent robot. "I can't seem to remember owning a droid, least of all a modern R2 unit. Most interesting. Most interesting indeed. Let's flip the record over so we can have some more music." And now I just need to find the spot that I just left off at. One moment, please. Ah, that's right at the end of the previous page. That's why I couldn't find that sentence. It was on the page before. Something drew the old man's gaze suddenly to the brow of nearby cliffs. I think it's best we make use of your land speeder, son. The sand people are easily startled, but they'll soon return, and in greater numbers. A land speeder is not a prize readily conceded, and after all, Jawas they're not. Placing both hands over his mouth in a peculiar fashion, Kenobi inhaled deeply and let out an unearthly howl that made Luke jump. That ought to keep any laggards running for a while yet, the old man concluded with satisfaction. That's a crate dragon call, Luke gaped in astonishment. How did you do that? I'll show you sometime, son. It's not too hard. Just takes the right attitude, a set of well-used vocal cords, and a lot of wind. Now, if you were an imperial bureaucrat, I could teach you right off, but you're not. He scanned the cliff spine again, and I don't think this is the time or place for it. Well, I won't argue with that. Luke was rubbing at the back of his head. Let's get started. That was when R2 let out a pathetic beep and whirled. Luke couldn't interpret the electronic squeal, but he could certainly comprehend the reason behind it. "Threepio," Luke exclaimed worriedly. R2 is already moving as fast as possible away from the land speeder. Come on, Ben. The little robot led him to the edge of a large sandpit. It stopped there. Pointing downward and squeaking mournfully, Luke saw where R2 was pointing, then started cautiously down the smooth, shifting slope, while Kenobi followed effortlessly. Threepio lay in the sand at the base of the slope, down which he had rolled and tumbled. His casing was dented and badly mangled. One arm lay broken and bent a short distance away. "Threepio," Luke called. There was no response. Shaking, the droid failed to activate anything. Opening a plate on the robot's back, Luke flipped a hidden switch on and off several times in succession. A low hum stopped, and started again, and then dropped to a normal purr. Using his remaining arm, Threepio rolled over and sat up. Where am I? He murmured, as his photoreceptors continued to clear. Then he recognized Luke.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I must have taken a bad step.
You're lucky any of your main circuits are still operational, Luke informed him. He looked significantly toward the top of the hill. Can you stand? We've got to get out of here before the Sand People return. Servo motors whirled in protest until Threepio ceased struggling.
I don't think I can make it. You go on, Master Luke. It doesn't make much sense to risk yourself on account of me. I'm finished.
No, you're not, Luke shot back, unaccountably affected by his recently encountered machine. But then, Threepio is not the usual uncommunicative, agri-functional device Luke was accustomed to dealing with. What kind of talk is that?
Logical,
Threepio informed him. Luke shook his head. A defeatist. With Luke and Ben Kenobi's aid, the battered droid somehow managed to struggle erect. Little R2 watched from the pit's rim. Hesitating partway up the slope, Kenobi snuffled the air suspiciously. Quickly, son. They're on the move again. Trying to watch the surrounding rocks and his footsteps simultaneously, Luke fought to drag Threepio clear of the pit. The decor of Ben Kenobi's well-concealed cave was Spartan, without appearing uncomfortable. It would not have suited most people, reflecting as it did its owner's peculiar eclectic tastes. The living area radiated an aura of lean comfort, with more importance attached to mental comforts than those of the outward human body. They had succeeded in vacating the canyon before the Tusken Raiders could return in force. Under Kenobi's direction, Luke left a trail behind them so confusing that not even a hypernasal Jawa could have followed it. Luke spent several hours ignoring the temptations of Kenobi's cave. Instead, he remained in the corner, which was equipped as a compact yet complete repair shop, working to fix Threepio's severed arm. Fortunately, the automatic overload disconnects had given way under the severe strain, sealing electronic nerves and ganglia without real damage. Repair was merely a matter of reattaching the limb to the shoulder, then activating the self-reseals. Had the arm been broken in mid-bone instead of a joint, such repairs would have been impossible, save at a factory shop. While Luke was occupied, Kenobi's attention was concentrated on Artoo Detoo. The squat droid sat passively on the cool cavern floor, while the old man fiddled with its metal insides. Finally, the man sat back with a humph of satisfaction and closed the open panels in the robot's rounded head. Now let's see if we can figure out what you are, my little friend, and where you came from. Luke was almost finished anyway, and Kenobi's words were sufficient to pull him away from the repair area. I saw part of the message, he began, and once more the striking portrait was being projected into empty space from the front of the little robot. Luke broke off, enraptured by its enigmatic beauty once again. Yes, I think I got it, Kenobi murmured contemplatively. The image continued to flicker, indicating a tape hastily prepared, but it was such sharper, better detailed now, Luke noted with admiration. One thing was apparent. Kenobi was skilled in subjects more specific than desert scavenging. General Obi-Wan Kenobi, the voice was saying, I present myself in the name of the world family of Alderaan and of the Alliance to restore the Republic. I break your solitude at the bidding of my father, Bail Organa, Viceroy and first chairman of the Alderaan system. Kenobi absorbed this extraordinary declamation while Luke's eyes bugged big enough to fall from his face. Years ago, General, the voice continued, you served the old Republic in the Clone Wars. Now my father begs you to aid us again in our most desperate hour. He would have you join him on Alderaan. You must go to him. I regret that I am unable to present my father's request to you in person. My mission to meet personally with you has failed. Hence, I have been forced to resort to this secondary method of communication. Information vital to the survival of the Alliance has been secured in the mind of this droid, this D2 unit. My father will know how to reactivate it. I plead with you to see this unit safely delivered to Alderaan. She paused, and when she continued, her words were hurried and less laced with formality. You must help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my last hope. I will be captured by agents of the Empire. They will learn nothing from me. Everything to be learned lies locked in the memory cells of this droid. Do not fail us, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Do not fail me. A small cloud of tridimensional static replaced the delicate portrait. Then it vanished entirely. Artoo Detoo gazed up expectantly at Kenobi. Luke's mind was muddy as he pond-laced with petroleum, unanchored, his thoughts and eyes turned for stability to the quiet figure seated nearby. The old man, the crazy wizard, the desert bum and all-around character whom his uncle and everyone else had known for as long as Luke could recall. If the breathless, anxiety-ridden message the unknown woman had just spoken into the cool air of the cave had affected Kenobi in any way, he gave no hint of it. Instead, he leaned back against the rock wall and tugged thoughtfully at his beard, puffing slowly on a water pipe of free-formed, tarnished chrome. Luke visualized that simple yet lovely portrait. She's so... His farming background didn't provide him with the requisite words. Suddenly, something of the message caused him to stare disbelievingly at the oldster. General Kenobi, you fought in the Clone Wars? But that was so long ago. Yes, Kenobi acknowledged, as casually as might have discussed the recipe for Shang stew. I guess it was a while back. I was a Jedi Knight once, like... he added, watching the youth appraisingly. Like your father. A Jedi Knight? Luke echoed. Then he looked confused. But my father didn't fight in the Clone Wars. He was no knight. Just a navigator on a space freighter. Kenobi's smile enfolded the pipe's mouthpiece. Oh, so your uncle has told you. His attention was suddenly focused elsewhere. Owen Lars didn't agree with your father's ideas, opinions, with his philosophy of life. He believed that your father should have stayed here on Tatooine, and not gotten involved in... Again, the seemingly indifferent shrug. Well, he thought he should have remained here and minded his farming. Luke said nothing, his body tense as the old man related bits and pieces of a personal history Luke had viewed only through his uncle's distortions. Owen was always afraid that your father's adventurous life might influence you, might pull you away from Anchorhead. He shook his head slowly, regretfully at the remembrance. I'm afraid there wasn't much of the farmer in your father. Luke turned away. He returned to cleaning the last particles of sand from Threepio's healing armature. I wish I'd known him, he finally whispered. He was the best pilot I ever knew, Kenobi went on, and a smart fighter. The Force, the instinct, was strong in him. For a brief second, Kenobi actually appeared old. He was also a good friend. Suddenly, the boyish twinkle returned to those piercing eyes, along with the old man's natural humor. I understand you're quite a pilot yourself. Piloting and navigation aren't hereditary, but a number of things that can combine to make a good small ship pilot are. Those you may have inherited. Still, even a duck has to be taught how to swim. What's a duck? Luke asked curiously. Never mind. In many ways, you are much like your father. Kenobi's unabashed look of evaluation made Luke nervous. You've grown up quite a bit since the last time I saw you. Having no reply for that, Luke waited silently as Kenobi sank back into deep contemplation. After a while, the old man stirred, evidently having reached an important decision. Oh, this reminds me, he declared with deceptive casualness. I have something for you. He rose and walked over to a bulky, old-fashioned chest and started rummaging through it. All sorts of intriguing items were removed and shoved around, only to be replaced back in the bin. A few of them Luke recognized. As Kenobi was obviously intent on something important, he forbore inquiring about any of the tantalizing flotsam. When you are old enough, Kenobi was saying, your father wanted you to have this. If I can ever find the blasted device. I tried to give it to you once before, but your uncle wouldn't allow it. He believed you might get some crazy ideas from it and end up following old Obi-Wan on some idealistic crusade. You see, Luke, that's where your father and your Uncle Owen disagreed. Lars is not a man to let idealism interfere with business, whereas your father didn't think the question even worth discussing. His decision on such matters came like his piloting, instinctively. Luke nodded. He finished picking out the last of the grit and looked around for one remaining component to snap back into Threepio's open chest plate. Locating the restraining module, he opened the receiving latches on the machine and set about locking it back in place. Threepio watched the process and appeared to wince ever so perceptibly. Luke stared into those metal and plastic photoreceptors for a long moment. Then he set the module pointedly on the workbench and closed the droid up. Threepio said nothing. A grunt came from behind them, and Luke turned to see a pleased Kenobi walking over. He handed Luke a small, innocuous-looking device, which the youth studied with interest. It consisted primarily of a short, thick hand grip and a couple of small switches set into the grip. Above this small post was a circular metal disc, barely larger in diameter than his spread palm. A number of unfamiliar, jewel-like components were built into both handle and disc, including what looked like the smallest power cell Luke had ever seen. The reverse side of the disc was polished to a mirror brightness, but it was the power cell that puzzled Luke the most. Whatever the thing was, it required a great deal of energy, according to the rating form of the cell. Despite the claim that it had belonged to his father, the gizmo looked newly manufactured. Kenobi had obviously kept it carefully. Only a number of minute scratches on the hand grip hinted at its previous usage. I'll interject here and add that now we all know that one of its previous usages was to slaughter a bunch of children. But that's not important to this story, so let's continue.
Sir,
came a familiar voice Luke hadn't heard in a while. What? Luke was startled out of his examination.
if you'll not be needing me,
Threepio declared.
I think I'll shut down for a bit. It will help the armature nerves to knit, and I'm due for some self-internal cleansing anyhow.
Sure, go ahead, Luke said absently, returning to his fascinated study of the whatever it was. Behind him, Threepio became silent, the glow fading temporarily from his eyes. Luke noticed that Kenobi was watching him with interest. What is it? He finally asked, unable, despite his best efforts, to identify the device. Your father's lightsaber, Kenobi told him. At one time, they were widely used. Still are in certain galactic quarters. Luke examined the controls on the handle, then tentatively touched a brightly colored button up near that mirrored pommel. Instantly, the disc put forth a blue-white beam as thick around as his thumb. It was dense to the point of opacity and a little over a meter in length. It did not fade, but remained as brilliant and intense as at its far end as it did next to the disc. Strangely, Luke felt no heat from it, though he was very careful not to touch it. He knew what a lightsaber could do, though he had never seen one before. It could drill a hole right through the rock wall of Kenobi's cave, or through a human being. This was the formal weapon of a Jedi Knight, explained Kenobi. Not as clumsy or random as a blaster. More skill than a simple sight was required for this. An elegant weapon. It was a symbol as well. Anyone can use a blaster or a fusion cutter, but to use a lightsaber well was a mark of someone a cut above the ordinary. He was pacing the floor of the cave as he spoke. For over 1,000 generations, Luke, the Jedi Knights were the most powerful, most respected force in the galaxy. They served as the guardians and the guarantors of peace and justice in the Old Republic. When Luke failed to ask what happened to them, since Kenobi looked up to see what the youth was staring vacantly into. Having absorbed little, if any, of the oldster's instruction, some men would have chided Luke for not paying attention. Not Kenobi. More sensitive than most, he waited patiently until the silence weighed strong enough on Luke for him to resume speaking. How, he asked slowly, did my father die? Kenobi hesitated, and Luke sensed that the old man had no wish to talk about this peculiar matter. Unlike Owen Lars, however, Kenobi was unable to take refuge in a comfortable lie. He was betrayed and murdered, Kenobi declared solemnly, by a very young Jedi named Darth Vader. He was not looking at Luke. A boy I was training, one of my brightest disciples, one of my greatest failures. Kenobi resumed his pacing. Vader used the training I gave him in the Force within him for evil, to help the later corrupt emperors. With the Jedi Knights disbanded, disorganized, or dead, there were few to oppose Vader. Today, they are all but extinct. An indecipherable expression crossed Kenobi's face. In many ways, they were too good, too trusting for their own health. They put too much trust in the stability of the Republic, failing to realize that while the body might be sound, the head was growing deceased and feeble, leaving it open to be manipulated by such as the Emperor. I wish I knew what Vader was after. Sometimes I have the feeling he is making time in preparation for some incomprehensible abomination. Such is the destiny of one who masters the Force and is consumed by its dark side. Luke's face twisted in confusion. A Force? That's the second time you've mentioned a Force. Kenobi nodded. I forget sometimes in whose presence I babble. Let us say simply that the Force is something a Jedi must deal with. While it has never been properly explained, scientists have theorized it is an energy field generated by living things. Early man suspected its existence, yet remained in ignorance of its potential for millennia. Midichlorians. Sorry for the interjection. Only certain individuals could recognize the Force for what it was. They were mercilessly labeled charlatans, fakers, mystics, and worse. Even fewer could make use of it, as it was usually beyond their primitive controls. It frequently was too powerful for them. They were misunderstood by their fellows, and worse. Kenobi made a wide, all-encompassing gesture with both arms. The Force surrounds us each and every one of us. Some men believe it directs our actions, and not the other way around. Knowledge of the Force and how to manipulate it is what gave the Jedi his special power. The arms came down, and Kenobi stared at Luke until the youth began to fidget uncomfortably. When he spoke again, it was a tone so crisp and unaged that Luke jumped in spite of himself. You must learn the ways of the Force also, Luke, if you are to come with me to Alderaan. Alderaan? Luke hopped off the repair seat, looking dazed. I'm not going to Alderaan. I don't even know where Alderaan is. Evaporators, droids, harvest. Abruptly, the surroundings seemed to close in on him. The formerly intriguing furnishings and alien artifacts now just a mite frightening. He looked around wildly, trying to avoid the piercing gaze of Ben Kenobi. Old Ben. Crazy Ben. General Obi-Wan. I've got to get back home, he found himself muttering thickly. It's late. I'm in for it as it is. Remembering something, he gestured toward the motionless bulk of Artoo Detoo. You can keep the droid. He seems to want you to. I'll think of something to tell my uncle. I hope, he added forlornly. I need your help, Luke, Kenobi explained, his manner a combination of sadness and steel. I'm getting too old for this kind of thing. Can't trust myself to finish it properly on my own. This mission is far too important. He nodded toward Artoo Detoo. You heard and saw the message. But I can't get involved with anything like that, protested Luke. I've got work to do. I've got crops to bring in. Even though Uncle Owen could always break down and hire a little extra help, I mean, one, I guess. But there's nothing I can do about it. Not now. Besides, that's all such a long way from here. The whole thing is really none of my business. That sounds like your uncle talking, Kenobi observed without rancor. Oh, my Uncle Owen. How am I going to explain all this to him? The old man suppressed a smile, aware that Luke's destiny had already been determined for him. It had been ordained 5 minutes before he had learned about the manner of his father's death. It had been ordained before that when he had heard the complete message. It had been fixed in the nature of things when he had first viewed the pleading portrait of the beautiful Senator Organa, awkwardly projected by the little droid. Kenobi shrugged inwardly. Likely, it had been finalized even before the boy was born. Not that Ben believed in predestination, but he did believe in heredity, and in the Force. Remember, Luke, the suffering of one man is the suffering of all. Distances are irrelevant to injustice. If not stopped soon enough, evil eventually reaches out to engulf all men, whether they have opposed it or ignored it. I suppose, Luke confessed nervously, I could take you as far as Anchorhead. You can get transport from there to Mos Eisley, or wherever you want to go. Very well, agreed Kenobi. That will do for a beginning. Then you must do what you feel is right. Luke turned away now, thoroughly confused. Okay, right now I don't feel too good. The record is ended, but we're almost at the end of the chapter, so I'm going to continue for a little bit more. The holding hole was deathly dim, with only the bare minimum of illumination provided. There was barely enough to see the black metal walls and the high ceiling overhead. The cell was designed to maximize a prisoner's feelings of helplessness. In this it achieved well, so much so that the single occupant started tensely as a hum came from one end of the chamber. The metal door, which began moving aside, was as thick as her body. As she mustered bitterly, they were afraid she might break through anything less massive with her bare hands. As if, she mused bitterly, they were afraid she might break through anything less massive with her bare hands. Straining to see outside, the girl saw several Imperial guards assume positions just outside the doorway. Eyeing them defiantly, Leia Organa backed up against the far wall. Her determined expression collapsed as soon as a monstrous black form entered the room, gliding smoothly as if on treads. Vader's presence crushed her spirit as thoroughly as an elephant would crush an eggshell. That villain was followed by an antiqued whip of a man who was only slightly less terrifying despite his minuscule appearance alongside the Dark Lord. Darth Vader made a gesture to someone outside. Something that hummed like a huge bee moved close and slipped inside the doorway. Leia choked on her own breath at the sight of the dark metal globe. It hung suspended on independent repulsors, a farrago of metal arms protruding from its sides. The arms were tipped with a multitude of delicate instruments. Leia studied the contraption fearfully. She had heard rumors of such machines, but had never really believed that Imperial technicians would construct such a monstrosity. Incorporated into its soulless memory was ever arbitrary, ever substantiated outrage known to mankind, and to several alien races as well. Vader and Tarkin stood there quietly, giving her plenty of time to study the hovering nightmare. The governor, in particular, did not delude himself into thinking that the mere presence of the device would shock her into giving up the information he needed. Not, he reflected, that the ensuing session would be especially unpleasant. There was always enlightenment and knowledge to be gained from such encounters, and the senator promised to be a most interesting subject. After a suitable interval had passed, he motioned to the machine. Now, Senator Organa, Princess Organa, we will discuss the location of the principal rebel base. The machine moved slowly toward her, traveling on a rising hum. Its indifferent spherical form blocked out Vader and the governor, the rest of the cell, the light. Muffled sounds penetrated the cell walls and thick door, drifting out into the hallway beyond. They barely intruded on the peace and quiet of the walkway running outside the sealed chamber. Even so, the guards stationed immediately outside managed to find excuses to edge a sufficient distance away to where those oddly modulated sounds could no longer be heard at all. And that is the end of Chapter 5. We will continue tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern on Chapter 6. Thanks again for joining me, my friends. Hope you're enjoying Star Wars, the novelization. I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.